They are the dominant power. They believe in American exceptionalism. They don't really care about international law.
We need Greenland.
They would take it within minutes. The notion that Denmark will shoot first and ask questions later, let's break that apart from both parties. So from an American perspective, we know that America is the indispensable power, the most exotic military in the world. The two key questions are political questions again. So can we is a military question, should we and must we are political questions. And in a rational world prior to 2026, you would say that can we and must we are ridiculous notions related to the first question, because I can't think of any time in history when a democracy has threatened to attack another democracy, nor a time in democratic history where a democracy has attacked another democracy. Denmark or Greenland is an autonomous part of Denmark, which is a NATO member. America is also a NATO member. At the left of ARC, we also see that there is always in NATO a cooperative relationship between people. And indeed, in terms of the basing of assets in NATO countries, and we know that in the UK, we've got RAF Lakenheath and Mildenhall, various intelligence assets at various bases in the UK. So in Greenland, we've got the space base at Pituffik. So at the left of ARC, could you have a status of forces agreement which would take American concerns about intrusions into the Arctic by either Russian or Chinese assets? And the answer to that is you can. So could they have cooperative bases? Of course they could. So do you need to get to a position where they would need to annex Greenland as the most extreme position? The answer to that is no. And I think that's why Jens Frederik Nielsen, the Prime Minister of Greenland, has recently said, please, let's have no more fantasies about annexation. Now, let's just row back a week to what happened in Venezuela, which is really relevant here, where you had, for example, Russia saying about the American operation in Venezuela that it was an act of armed aggression, a gross violation of international law and sovereignty, and a dangerous precedent for international relations. If America were to do a military operation in Greenland which sought to annex it, then you would have this absurd and profound disturbance in the vortex of the universe, where you would probably have Russia supporting NATO in the action of America against a NATO ally. Now, in a normal world, you would say that's absurd. But what the last week has also taught us is that hard power is a reality. And really, if you've got a road where you've got a bicycle coming down one part of the road and a tank coming down the other opposite direction, the person who's driving the bicycle cares more about international law than the person who's driving the tank. Now, of course, in terms of Greenland and Denmark and the US is driving the tank and Denmark is driving the bicycle. But the real problem is that US historically, and even in Trump's sort of missives about what he's achieved since his presidency, he's recently said in the Mar-a-Lago thing, for example, he's now solved 8.25 disputes in the world. Normally, the US is the mediator. The US is not the predator. If the US were to be a predator and use military action, then absolutely, I think we're looking at a different world when potentially you could have NATO Article 5 within NATO. That's just the absurdity that doesn't bear thinking. What you also could have, for example, is at the moment is you could have Denmark calling for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council based on Chapter 7, that is threats to the international order. The ambiguity in language that Trump uses and some of his subordinates is not the normal language that you would hear from patient diplomacy in the way that people generally do business. So of course that's worrying, but the norms of what we believe to be the international order are looking sort of fairly frayed at the moment, and it's difficult to see that being rowed back from when you've got the Trump administration at the moment. What it would be interesting, of course, is from a NATO perspective, you should have some indicators and warnings if there were to be an invasion of Greenland, God forbid, because Greenland is a long way from anywhere. So you would either infiltrate via the use of the space base by special forces over a period of time, then tries to fulfill a sort of Anschluss, really, because that's really what it would be. The sort of joining of Greenland is. And of course, it was that sort of appeasement that ultimately led to Czechoslovakia and the Second World War. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that NATO is going to go to war against another NATO member, but it just shows the sort of how things are just messed up from how we would generally use sort of logic and history to look at problem solving in the 20th and now the 21st century. And 2026 is going to be a year like no other, I think. And already we've got to the notion when that sort of quote from Lenin that there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. 2026 is already looking at one of those years when weeks when decades happen. The optics would be terrible. There's just no good way that you could spin that as being to the health of the international order in the 21st century. There could be a subtext to this because, one of the things about Venezuela is, of course, they don't need the oil. There's absolutely no way that they need the oil. And oil experts that I know who were going to be used in 2019 when they thought different, the opposition leader Guaido was going to come in, were a senior executive that I know was engaged in looking at the Venezuelan infrastructure. But the notion that the oil companies are going to rush into Venezuela is probably not proven. Then you have a different subtext which may apply both to Greenland and to Venezuela. One of the things that Trump said is we don't need the oil, we don't need the rare earth minerals, we've got plenty of both. They do have plenty of oil. They don't have plenty of sovereign autonomy on rare earth minerals. The Chinese were hovering up the rare earth minerals in Venezuela. There are potentially a number of rare earth minerals in Greenland. So there could always be a subtext to this that they're not sort of not really making explicit. It's easy to sell the sort of national security from a military perspective, less so in this case because of the fact that Denmark is a part of NATO. But there could be a subtext which is just not in the open domain on this. I do not see Denmark, and therefore by extension NATO, going to war with America in a million years. That's just not something that's going to happen. So the notion that Denmark will shoot first and ask questions later is again sort of rhetoric from somewhere, which isn't proven. Neither does any of the population of Denmark or Greenland want to be part of America. So, for example, the statistics on that are in the 2025 elections. The only political party that trusted Trump got 1% in the election and no seats. So in terms of how the norms of international law and how things might pan out, I just don't see any equivalence between what's been happening. So, we know that Venezuela was a terrible authoritarian state with Iranian, Chinese and Russian assets in there. And we also know that America doesn't want, in terms of its Western design and the hegemony of the Western Hemisphere, doesn't want any of those three countries anywhere near the Western Hemisphere. Part of this sort of Dunroe doctrine, so-called recently by Trump. But neither does that mean that you need to take over a country. Neither does it mean that you can't negate the Chinese and Russian influence and assets, which is really what Trump has been talking about, by other means. And that other means should be a cooperative relationship within NATO, in the same way that yesterday we seemed to get to some sort of unified security architecture looking at Ukraine, which showed this cooperative aspect within the European part of NATO and the transatlantic part of NATO.